Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle, and welcome to the National Parks Adventure, Crossing America. Today, we're at Alcatraz Island National Historic Site in San Francisco. A special thanks to the National Park Foundation for their collaboration. We are here with Ranger Benny. Ranger Benny, thank you so much for having us here.
Well, thank you for coming today.
Well, tell us how you got to the national parks, and then especially Alcatraz.
Well, I got to the national park through a roundabout way. I actually worked in Yosemite National Park for the park's Conservancy. It's an organization to raise money for the park. At the time, that it was called Yosemite Association. I actually worked in the bookstore there in the visitor center, and I got really inspired to work in the park, working around rangers and telling people where the best trails to go and answering questions in the visitor center. And I found that I enjoyed doing that and helping people out and learning about the environment around the park. And I got really inspired to work in the parks.
And so then you moved here, and you've been here quite a while, haven't you?
Yes, I have. I've been here for about 30 years, yeah.
And so this is now your sort of resting spot with the national parks. I mean, you may go somewhere else later, but I think you like it here,
I like
right?
it here, yes, I do.
Tell us what you do here, and then we'll talk more about the park.
My primary responsibility is education. I work with a team of great educators that work at the other sites, and we collaborate to develop education programs, curriculum-based programs that bring Alcatraz to the students and has the island as an outdoor classroom, and the same as our other sites, like at Muir Woods and at the Presidio San Francisco and Fort Point. The primary goal in our education program is to bring students who otherwise would not have the opportunity to visit parks. So we really try to bring Title I schools, under-resourced schools to come out to our sites to learn about the history of the island and also showcase those stories that not often heard about, like for example at Alcatraz, untold stories at our site. I like to acknowledge this is the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, and they are still here.
So tell us how Alcatraz Island became a park, a little bit about the history, and then I'm hoping to uncover some of those stories.
Alcatraz became a national park because of the history, the many layers of history, but it became a national park because it actually has a lot to do with the untold story of the occupation of Alcatraz. The message up here that says Indians welcome, Indian land. In 1969, when the occupation happened, the island was actually up for sale. The government was going to sell Alcatraz to a developer, tear down all the buildings, and it was going to become a space museum and a shopping mall, basically. When the occupation happened, the goal of the occupation was to bring attention to the plight of American Indians, but also, most importantly, was to create a cultural center and a museum. And they did gain a lot of support for the occupation, and that occupation lasted 19 months. The idea of the occupation was to, they call it a group of Muslim college students, was to bring attention to the plight of American Indians and also create a cultural center and a museum. And they did just that. They got a lot of support, and it started a movement that began here in Alcatraz that spread nationwide, and it still resonates with the Native American community today. Now, because of that, indirectly, this becomes a national park because the Department of Interior, the National Park Service, realized the importance of this island and the story it tells, the many stories it tells, besides the stories that most people know about, Al Capone, the gangsters and things like that. The National Park Service here in Alcatraz showcases those stories you don't know about, those untold stories, like the occupation, the stories of the conscience objectors who were in prison here in Alcatraz, and the stories of a man incarcerated in here, how those stories resonates with the communities that we work with in our schools.
So it didn't start out as a prison. It started out as a fort,
Right.
correct, in the Civil War. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. It started off as a fort in the 1850s. The fort was because California, of course, during the gold rush, becomes the richest state in the nation, and the Army wanted to protect those resources. They wanted to protect the shipments of gold coming in and out of the harbor. So they built a fort here in the 1850s. Along with the fort here in Alcatraz, another fort was built called Fort Point. It's a building you see under the Golden Gate Bridge. If you happen to come to San Francisco and see that brick building there, that's called Fort Point. And Alcatraz protected the harbor. The ironic thing is, Alcatraz starts off as a fort where you had over 100 guns that face out to keep people off the island. Over time, Alcatraz evolves into a place where we keep people on the island as a military prison. So it starts off as a fort, then a military prison, and then a federal prison. The federal prison is actually only a short span of time, from 1934 to 1963. It closes as a prison, becomes surplus land. The government is not sure what to do with the island, and then in 1969 there would be an occupation of the islands I mentioned earlier. Actually, there was another occupation in 1964 that involved just 5 people, and it was a short-lived occupation, but that occupation, 1964, planted a seed for more organized occupation that would happen in the 60s. And that's very important to realize the time, the context. In the 1960s, you had the Vietnam War, civil rights movements, the free speech movements. All these things were happening at the same time that the occupation happens. And that also is very important to understand when we are talking about in our education programs as well, is that students understand context and why things happened.
So I think it was interesting that you sort of compared keeping people off the island to keeping people on the island.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that they wanted this to be a prison because of that reason, that people couldn't get off.
That's right.
Were there any attempted escapes here?
Yeah, there were a number of attempted escapes, both during the military era and both during the federal prison era. And they were made famous through Hollywood films, like, of course, like Escape from Alcatraz and other films like that, that actually brings a lot of curiosity to this place for years, and that's why we have 5,000 people a day that visit this island, because they want to hear those stories about those escapes, Al Capone and all that. But that provides an opportunity for us here on the island to tell those stories that they don't know about.
That excites me. Can you tell me one of yours that you really like to tell?
Well, one in particular I like to tell is the fact that there was a man by the name of Robert Lipscomb who was in prison here in Alcatraz in the 1950s, and he was in prison. He was in prison for counterfeiting. He got a 25-year prison charge for counterfeiting, and in his imprisonment, he realized the inequities. He was an African-American man, inequities in prison. And the fact that he was not allowed to get the best jobs while in prison, but also, more importantly, he fought segregation in the prison using the Brown versus Board of Education stance. He would protest the fact that this is a federal prison, it should be integrated, and also, most importantly, the jobs it provides. And he did this while here in Alcatraz. He was sent here because of his stance and as a troublemaker. He considered a racial agitator, he was called, at Leavenworth. So he was sent here to Alcatraz. He did time here. He wrote a number of letters to prison officials and even the Attorney General of at the time, Robert F. Kennedy. We don't know whatever happened to those letters, and we do know that his story is a story that people don't hear about. And we have a program in our education program, the high school program, that focuses on stories like that. Another story is a man who was here during the what was then called the Great War. And he was here as a conscientious objector along with other conscientious objectors, and he protested about not wanting to fight in that war. Again, putting context at the time. Jim Crow was a law of the land at the time. And when he was brought to Alcatraz in the winter of 1918, he received a 10-year sentence for being a conscientious objector, and actually treated horribly here on the island, put in the dungeon below the cell block, and he would leave Alcatraz in 1920 in February. And the thing about his story is we don't know what happened to him afterwards, so still a lot to uncover. There's another story of people who were brought here in 1895, Native Americans from the Hopi tribe. They were brought here because they refused to have their children being taken away from them and sent to government-run boarding schools. They were sent all the way from Arizona. They were rounded up by the Army, and they would do almost a year here in Alcatraz. They were Hopi leaders, elders in the community, and they would leave Alcatraz, and again, we don't know what happened to them afterwards, but the fact that they were incarcerated here because they wanted to hold on to their beliefs and their culture. And what's interesting about that story, and what's important about the story when we talk about this with the public and our education and our programs to the general public, but also in our education programs, is the fact that the story of the Hopi imprisoned in Alcatraz can be directly tied to the message that we see on the island when we arrive here that says Indians welcome Indian land. In modern times, people are fighting for their sovereignty, and the same thing happened in earlier times. So the idea when students learn history is that they learn that nothing happens in isolation in history. There's a through line then and now, and that's what we try to do in our programs and promote inquiry and critical thinking skills in our programming.
So Ranger Benny, I'm excited to get inside and see some more of this history. Can we do that?
Of course, yeah, I'd love to do that. Here you notice the two pulleys. There's a drawbridge here, and it says 1857. So we're now entering the...
That seems really strange that families would have been here.
Yeah,
It's a place that housed dangerous.
Yeah, they were all... The water tower was built in the 1930s. This is called the New Institute Building. They made things like gloves and brushes and brooms for video about these This photo here, one of the people involved in the occupation, she was a kid when she was read the stories of why you see it. So they had to tear the original lighthouse out and build this one in 1909.
Okay.
So you can see it out in the ocean.
We followed it.
And we walked to the Industries Building,
Right.
and this is the model industry building. I was talking about Robert Simmons earlier, and in this space right here, we look up to the sky because we're in a moat right now. This is the dry moat torn out in about 1939 because higher up in the Federal Bureau of Prisons saw a condition of light coming in because there was light from the moat because that was outside. That's out the rec yard out there on the weekends.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for the tour. There's so much information, and if walls could talk,
Yes,
right? It
yeah.
was just really interesting. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
The intersection between when it was a military prison and people were brought here for not wanting to fight,
Mm-hmm.
and then it became a federal prison where people were brought here for probably fighting.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
very intriguing to me
Uh-huh.
that we're not always just
Yeah.
in the things that we do, which leads us, I think, to our challenge for our kids.
Yeah.
All right. So kids, as you know, we like to use the United Nations Sustainability Global Goals to frame our situations that we want you to try to tackle. So we're going to look at goal number 16, which is all about social justice. So now if you read through this goal with your teachers, you're going to find that this encompasses a lot of things. But I like to call this goal just be a good human goal, where we have to learn how to tell our own story and to uncover stories that haven't been told before because their voices are no longer heard. So I want you to think about what you've learned here today, what you're going to research about Alcatraz, and take that back to your communities. Are there stories that you've heard about in school or in church or in your community that need to be told? Maybe someone that did something pretty amazing 100 years ago but got no credit for it. Maybe there's someone in your community that was unjustly bullied or talked about. What can you do to make sure that those unheard stories are heard again by helping them find their voice, or if they're no longer able to do that, that you help them find their voice? You know, we talk about how we need you to start saving the world. As older people, Ranger Benny and I, we're doing what we can, but you are the new generation that we want to raise up to be those good humans, to point out injustices and find ways to make things more just. So we want you to tell those stories, make sure you're telling them correctly, which means you may have to go to the source. You may have to go to a relative. Make sure you're telling the right story, and then let's share those. They can either be oral histories, they could be an essay that you write, it could be a poem in tribute to the person that you're talking about. But we want you to share these with at Dacia 92 and also with the Alcatraz National Historic Site and Ranger Benny. And would you please also tag the National Park Foundation so that we can share those ideas with others. So it's hashtag Crossing America, and you're going to see all of this running across the bottom of the screen. Now, I want to make sure, Ranger Benny, that when they do this work, that they're using what we call primary resources and sources. So is that what you do?
Yes.
And you interpret here?
Yes, exactly. Before they visit the island, they do a pre-site activities in the classroom to learn about for example, Robert Lipscomb, the man I mentioned. They use primary documents and do a lot of teaching each other with these documents, and the teacher does a number of activities. And then when they come to the island, they're prepared to be at a place where this history took place. And there are a lot of stories in the community. They're in our own backyard that tell not only the story of what happened to Robert Lipscomb or the Hopi, they were imprisoned in Alcatraz. Those stories resonate what happened here, but also those stories tell a much broader story than just what happened to those men. And that's the most important thing when students learn history, is that the stories are not only also universal, but also broader in the themes and the context of what happened to those men.
Absolutely. So I think when they're looking for stories in their communities, they want to, one, make sure that they're getting the right story.
Yes,
there may not be anything written down yet, but they can either find the person or a relative, tell the right story, and then look at the broader picture of that. In every place that we live in the country, there are probably people that lived there before us.
Yes.
So make sure we're acknowledging who was on this land first.
Right.
Maybe have those stories told also. I can't wait to see what they create.
Yes.
What they learn from this place can make their place even better.
Right.
Because they're trying to be really good humans. One of our favorite things to do during these interviews is to have a ranger actually just talk right to the kids and give them any advice they may have on wearing your flat hat one day. So can you look in that camera and just give them a little bit of advice?
Well, the one advice I'd like to share with the students is course, you want to stay in school, but also you want to have a passion. If you have a passion about something you really care about, you can volunteer in your national parks. You can become an intern in your national parks and work with the park rangers and get an idea of what it's like to be a park ranger and work in that space and learn from them, but also see if it's not something you really like to do. I think that that's one of the best ways, is to learn by doing.
Well, I think that's great advice, and I think that's what they're going to do. So, kids, thank you so much for joining us today at Alcatraz Island National Historic Site in San Francisco with Ranger Benny. So thank you so much to the National Park Foundation for our collaboration. So on behalf of Dr. Drizzle and Ranger Benny, we are out of here.
All right, thank you.